My name is Arthur Kessler, and I am 78 years old. 2 months ago, at a family dinner at my daughter's house, my son-in-law leaned back in his chair, gestured toward me with his wine glass, and told his business partner, seated across the table, that his father-in-law was, and I quote, kind of a nobody, retired from some boring government job nobody's ever heard of. What Marcus didn't know, sitting there laughing at his own joke, was that for 19 years, I had run a regional office whose decisions had shaped intelligence operations across an entire continent, and that the quiet, boring government job he was mocking had, on more than one occasion, been the reason certain very bad days never happened to this country at all. If you've ever spent decades in silence because your work required it, only to be dismissed by someone who mistook that silence for insignificance, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when 4 decades of necessary quiet finally, carefully, comes into the light. Welcome to Silent Honor USA. If this story speaks to you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And subscribe, because you'll want to see exactly how the rest of that dinner table's understanding of me changed forever. I need to tell you about the shape of my career before I tell you about that dinner table. Though I want to be honest up front that there are limits to what I can actually share, even now, even in a story like this one. Some of what I did remains classified for reasons that have nothing to do with me personally and everything to do with protecting methods and people that still, decades later, need protecting. I joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1971, 24 years old, recruited quietly out of graduate school where I'd been studying Soviet economic policy. A background that turned out to be considerably more useful to certain people than I understood at the time. I remember the specific interview, conducted in a nondescript office building in downtown Washington that gave no outward indication of what it actually housed, and I remember the particular gravity in the recruiter's voice when he explained, plainly, that accepting this position meant accepting a life where large portions of what I did would never be discussed with anyone outside a small circle of people cleared to know it, potentially for the rest of my life. I said yes anyway, 24 years old and certain, in the particular way only the young can be certain, that I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. I spent my first decade in analysis, reading reports, building assessments, the unglamorous foundational work that most people, even those who watch spy movies obsessively, never think to associate with intelligence work at all. Those years taught me something I've carried for the rest of my career, that the most consequential work rarely looks dramatic from the outside, that entire outcomes can shift based on a single analyst noticing a pattern buried in pages of otherwise unremarkable reporting, work that produces no visible medal, no public recognition, simply the quiet, invisible prevention of outcomes that never happen, precisely because someone did their job correctly. By my mid-30s, I'd moved into operations, and by my late 40s, I was running a regional office, responsible for coordinating intelligence activities across a significant portion of a continent whose specific name I'm still not at liberty to state plainly, even decades removed from the work itself. I held that position for 19 years, the final chapter of a career that spanned, in total, 31 years with the agency, before I retired quietly in 2002. At 55 years old, into a life that, from the outside, looks almost aggressively unremarkable. Those 19 years running that regional office represented, without question, the most demanding and consequential period of my professional life, decisions made under pressure that I still, even now, am not permitted to discuss in any detail, personnel I was responsible for whose safety depended on judgment calls I had to make, often with incomplete information, and very little time. I want to say, as plainly as the constraints of my career allow, that some of those decisions almost certainly prevented outcomes that would have cost lives on a scale most people never consider when they think about the ordinary safety of their daily existence. I carry that weight quietly, the way most people in my former line of work learned to carry it, without ever expecting or particularly wanting acknowledgement for it. I live in a modest 3-bedroom house outside of Alexandria, Virginia. I drive a 12-year-old sedan. I spend my mornings gardening and my afternoons reading, mostly history, occasionally fiction, and I have never once, in the 23 years since retiring, discussed the specifics of my career with anyone outside a small handful of former colleagues who understand, without needing explanation, exactly why certain conversations simply cannot happen at a dinner table. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to understanding the rest of this story. My family has always known, in the vaguest possible terms, that I worked for the government in some capacity related to foreign affairs. That's the entire scope of what I've ever been able to tell them, not because I didn't trust them, but because the nature of the work itself made anything more specific genuinely, legally impossible to share, regardless of how much I might have wanted to explain myself more fully over the years. My wife Diane passed 6 years ago, and she carried, throughout our 41 years of marriage, an understanding of my career built almost entirely on trust rather than detail, an act of faith I've never stopped being grateful for. I remember, early in our marriage, Diane asking questions the way any new wife naturally would. And I remember the particular careful conversation we had, maybe 6 months after our wedding, where I explained, as fully as I was permitted, that there would always be an entire dimension of my life she simply could not access. Not because I didn't trust her, but because trust itself wasn't the relevant factor, only clearance and legal necessity. She absorbed that explanation with a grace I've thought about often in the years since, and she never once, in 41 years, pushed harder against that boundary than the boundary itself allowed. An extraordinary act of patience I don't think I ever adequately thanked her for while she was alive to hear it. We raised one daughter, Vivian, who grew up like most children of intelligence officers, absorbing a general sense that her father's work was significant without ever having access to specifics. A childhood shaped by unexplained absences, and a father who, even at home, carried a particular watchfulness that I know, now, occasionally unsettled her in ways I never adequately addressed. I remember missing her 8th grade graduation for reasons I could never explain, returning home 4 days later with nothing more to offer than a generic apology and a gift that couldn't possibly compensate for my absence. And I remember the particular hurt in her expression that told me, even then, that the vagueness surrounding my career was accumulating a cost I wasn't fully accounting for in the moment, too consumed by the actual demands of the work itself to properly reckon with what it was costing at home. Vivian married Marcus about 8 years ago. Marcus runs a moderately successful commercial real estate firm, a career built on visible, measurable success, deals closed, buildings developed, numbers that can be displayed and discussed openly at any dinner table without a single classification concern. I don't say that to diminish what Marcus has built, which represents genuine, real accomplishment. I say it because I think it matters to understanding the particular dynamic that developed between us over the years. A dynamic where Marcus's success was always fully visible, and mine, by absolute necessity, never could be. I noticed, over the years of Marcus and Vivian's marriage, a particular pattern developing in how Marcus discussed my career, both to my face and, I gathered from occasional secondhand comments, to others. Early on, it was simple curiosity, questions I gently deflected with vague, practiced answers about government work and foreign policy analysis, answers I'd refined over decades to sound complete, while revealing essentially nothing. I remember, at their engagement party, Marcus asking me directly, with genuine interest, what exactly I'd done, and I remember watching his expression shift, subtly, when my answer offered nothing more concrete than it ever did, a flicker of something between disappointment and suspicion that I recognized immediately, having watched that same reaction cross other faces many times over the decades. Over time, as those questions consistently produced nothing more substantial, I watched Marcus's curiosity curdle into something closer to dismissal, an assumption that my vagueness reflected insignificance rather than genuine legal restriction. He began making small jokes about it at family gatherings, nothing overtly unkind at first, references to my top-secret retirement, or asking, with a grin, whether I'd finally be allowed to tell everyone what I actually did once enough decades had passed. I usually laughed along with these jokes, understanding them as a fairly natural response to genuine, persistent mystery. Though I noticed, over the years, the tone shifting gradually from playful curiosity into something with a harder edge underneath it, a growing certainty, unspoken but increasingly evident, that Marcus had concluded there simply wasn't much of a story behind my silence. 2 months ago, Vivian hosted a dinner at their house, a business partner of Marcus's in attendance along with his wife. A dinner intended, as far as I understood it, partly as a genuine family gathering and partly as an opportunity for Marcus to entertain someone significant to his business relationships. I arrived, as I always do, quietly, bringing a bottle of wine, prepared for the kind of pleasant, surface-level conversation that has characterized most of my family gatherings for the past 2 decades. The dining room was set nicely, candles lit, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the early part of the evening, listening to Marcus's business partner describe an ambitious new development project with evident enthusiasm, catching up with Vivian about her own work managing a nonprofit arts program. About an hour into the dinner, conversation turned to careers, Marcus's business partner asking, with genuine friendly curiosity, what I'd done before retirement. I gave my usual answer, something about spending my career in government service related to foreign affairs analysis, an answer I've delivered so many times over the decades that it emerges almost automatically, carefully vague without technically being dishonest, delivered with just enough specificity to sound like a complete answer, while revealing essentially nothing verifiable. Marcus, perhaps emboldened by wine, perhaps simply comfortable enough in his own home to say something he might have held back elsewhere, laughed and leaned back in his chair, the particular confident posture of a man about to make what he assumes will be an amusing observation. Arthur here is a bit of a mystery man, he said, gesturing toward me with his wine glass, addressing his business partner directly. Spent his whole career doing something in government nobody can ever get a straight answer about. Honestly, between us, I think it's probably just because there's not much of a story there. He's kind of a nobody, retired from some boring government job nobody's ever heard of. I used to ask more questions, but I think the honest answer is just, nothing too exciting ever happened. His business partner laughed politely, the kind of laugh people offer at a joke they're not entirely sure landed the way it was intended, glancing briefly at me to gauge my reaction. Vivian, seated near me, went very still, and I noticed her glance toward me with an expression I recognized immediately as embarrassment, though I couldn't tell in that moment whether it was embarrassment on my behalf or embarrassment about her husband's careless comment, or perhaps some uncomfortable combination of both. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger. Men who've spent 3 decades in intelligence work develop a particular capacity to absorb dismissal without much visible reaction, a professional habit that serves you well at dinner tables, even when it costs something internally. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired familiarity with a pattern that had been building for years, spoken now plainly, in front of an audience, at my own daughter's dinner table. I didn't respond directly. I said something mild about government work rarely being as exciting as people imagine, and the conversation moved on to other topics, the way these moments usually do, absorbed into the general flow of a dinner party rather than confronted directly. What happened next, I want to be clear, emerged from an entirely unplanned convergence of circumstances, nothing I orchestrated or anticipated. About 3 weeks after that dinner, Marcus mentioned, during a separate family gathering, that his business partner's father-in-law, a man named Richard Halloway, was joining them for an upcoming golf outing, someone Marcus was eager to impress, given some pending business relationship between their firms. He mentioned the name casually, and something in my memory stirred immediately, a recognition I didn't share in that moment, wanting to be certain before I said anything. I want to tell you something about how intelligence careers work that most people don't fully understand. You build relationships, over decades, with people whose full names and current lives you sometimes only partially know. Connections built around specific operations or specific moments of shared, classified experience. Relationships that then simply continue, quietly, into civilian life, carrying a particular weight neither party can fully explain to anyone outside that shared history. Richard Halloway, as it turned out, based on details Marcus mentioned about his career and general background, was almost certainly a man I had worked with directly on a specific operation nearly 30 years earlier, a man whose actual professional background, similarly classified for decades, had likely also settled into a quiet, unremarkable retirement narrative for his own family, the same way mine had for me. I attended that golf outing, at Marcus's invitation, mostly out of curiosity about whether my suspicion was correct, though I told myself, driving to the club that morning, that even if I was right, I had no particular plan for what, if anything, I might say or do with that recognition. Richard Halloway recognized me the moment I extended my hand, his expression shifting rapidly from polite greeting into genuine startled recognition, his hand pausing mid-shake as the name apparently registered fully. "Arthur Kessler," he said quietly, in a tone that carried considerably more weight than a simple hello. The particular controlled surprise of a man who has spent decades training himself not to react visibly to anything, momentarily failing to maintain that discipline. "I haven't seen you since Vienna." Marcus, standing nearby, holding a golf bag and looking between us with visible confusion, clearly having expected nothing more than a routine introduction. "Wait, you two know each other?" Richard and I exchanged a careful glance, the particular silent communication of two people who understand exactly what can and cannot be said in a given moment, a kind of coded fluency built from decades of operating inside the same constraints. "We worked together, briefly, a long time ago," Richard said, choosing his words with obvious precision, each one weighed before it left his mouth. "Government work, actually. Arthur ran a regional office that, frankly, some of us considered one of the more consequential postings in the entire organization during that period." Marcus's face shifted, processing this information visibly, his earlier confident dismissal from that dinner table clearly resurfacing in his own mind. "Wait, what kind of government work exactly?" Richard smiled, the particular careful smile of a man who spent decades learning how to answer that question without actually answering it. A professional habit so deeply ingrained it emerged automatically, even in a casual golf club setting. "The kind that doesn't come with much of a story you can tell at dinner, Marcus. But I promise you, your father-in-law's career was considerably more significant than nobody's ever heard of." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, watching Marcus's confident, dismissive narrative about me visibly destabilize in real time. Part of me felt a certain quiet vindication, but a larger part felt something more complicated, an old, practiced discomfort, with even this much attention being drawn toward work that had, by absolute necessity, required decades of careful invisibility. Richard and I spoke privately for a few minutes later that afternoon, away from the rest of the group, reminiscing carefully, in the particular coded language two former intelligence officers use when discussing shared history in a setting where anyone might overhear. Before we parted, he said something that stayed with me. "You know, Arthur, I never told my own family much more than you've apparently told yours. I think we both made the same calculation, decades ago, that the work mattered more than being understood. I don't regret that calculation, but I sometimes wonder what it costs the people who love us, watching us be quietly underestimated for 40 years because we couldn't defend ourselves." That evening, Marcus called me directly, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard from him before, something considerably more careful than his usual confident ease, the particular subdued quality of a man reconsidering an assumption he'd held comfortably for years. "Arthur," he said, "I need to apologize. What I said at dinner, about you being a nobody, I said that because I genuinely thought there was nothing behind the vagueness, that you were just a quiet guy who'd had an unremarkable career. Richard clearly thinks otherwise, and I feel like an idiot for how I talked about you in front of my business partner." "Marcus," I said, "I understand why you drew that conclusion. I've spent decades giving vague, unsatisfying answers because I legally couldn't give anything more specific, and I understand how that vagueness might read as insignificance to someone who's never had to operate that way. I'm not upset that you didn't know the specifics. I'm asking you to understand that a lack of visible detail was never the same thing as a lack of substance. I hear you, Marcus said, and I could hear him genuinely sitting with that distinction, turning it over. I think I've spent our whole relationship measuring you against a standard built entirely around visible success, deals, numbers, things you can point to and explain in a sentence. And I never considered that some of the most significant work a person can do is work that, by design, can never be explained that way. I run a business where every accomplishment is public, every deal gets announced, every success gets measured in numbers everyone can see. I think that made it easy for me to assume that anything I couldn't see or measure just wasn't there. We talked for a while longer that evening, a conversation considerably more honest than anything Marcus and I had managed in 8 years of marriage to my daughter. I didn't share operational specifics because I legally couldn't, but I told him, in general terms, about the weight of decisions I'd once made, about the particular loneliness of carrying consequential responsibility that could never be discussed with the people you loved most, about Diane's decades of trust in a marriage built partly on things she was never permitted to fully know. Marcus asked, near the end of that call, what it had actually felt like, carrying that weight alone for so many years, and I found myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, actually trying to answer that question honestly, rather than deflecting it the way I'd trained myself to do for decades. In the 2 months since, something has genuinely shifted in how Marcus talks about me, and to me. He's stopped making the vague jokes about my mystery career that had become something of a running bit at family gatherings over the years. He's asked, more than once, general questions about what a career like mine actually demanded, questions I answer as fully as I'm permitted to, which is admittedly still quite limited, but delivered now with a genuine curiosity rather than the previous dismissive humor. He mentioned, during one recent visit, that he'd started reading declassified histories of Cold War intelligence operations, wanting some general sense of the world I'd spent 31 years inside of, even knowing he'd never get my own specific stories. Vivian told me recently that Marcus had started describing my career to people who asked, with considerably more respect, something along the lines of, spent decades in intelligence work I'm not allowed to know much about, but from what I understand, it mattered a great deal. A description that, while still necessarily vague, carries an entirely different weight than nobody or boring government job. She also mentioned that Marcus had asked her, privately, whether she thought I might be willing to talk more, in whatever limited way was actually possible, about what those decades had cost me personally, an offer of genuine curiosity that felt different from his previous careless jokes. Richard and I have stayed in touch since that golf outing, meeting for coffee twice now, conversations that move carefully around the specific boundaries our shared history requires, but that carry a particular comfort I haven't experienced with many people since retiring. The rare relief of being fully understood by someone without needing to explain anything at all. During our first coffee meeting, we spent nearly 2 hours simply reminiscing in the careful, coded language two former intelligence officers use when discussing shared history in a public setting, references and half-sentences that would mean nothing to an outside listener, but that carried, between the two of us, entire chapters of shared experience neither of us could ever fully articulate to anyone else. He mentioned during our last meeting that he'd had a similar conversation with his own son-in-law recently, prompted, he said, by hearing about what had happened with Marcus, a small ripple effect neither of us had anticipated from one unplanned recognition on a golf course. It's strange, Richard said, stirring his coffee slowly, how many of us made the exact same calculation decades ago and never once compared notes about what it actually cost. I wonder how many other men our age are sitting in family rooms right now, being quietly underestimated by people who have no idea what they actually gave up to protect this country. I've thought about that comment often since he said it, the particular strange loneliness of an entire generation of quiet men, scattered now across ordinary retirements in ordinary neighborhoods, carrying decades of consequential, invisible work that most of the people around them will simply never have any reason to fully understand or appreciate. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old man dismissed at his own daughter's dinner table. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Some of the most significant work people do in their lives is work that, by its very nature, can never be fully explained or displayed. Work that requires decades of careful, necessary silence. That silence is not the same thing as insignificance, even when it's mistaken for exactly that, by people who've never had to operate inside it. Real respect sometimes requires trusting that a person's vagueness reflects genuine constraint rather than genuine emptiness, and having the humility to consider that some of the most consequential lives are the ones we'll never fully get to hear the details of. I spent decades being quietly dismissed as insignificant by people who mistook necessary silence for genuine unimportance. It turned out that silence had been protecting decisions and operations that shaped outcomes across an entire continent, and it took one unexpected recognition, at a golf outing neither of us planned, to finally let a small piece of that truth into the light. Enough, at least, for my own family to finally understand there had always been considerably more to the story than they'd ever been permitted to see. If this story reminded you of someone in your life whose quiet work you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.